Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Cash, Commissioner, Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities.
Robert, okay. Well, let's get started. I know that we're running a little late here, so let's not waste any more time. I'm David Cash from Massachusetts. Before I get into intro, I want all of my colleagues on the panel to introduce themselves as well, and as quickly as they can. So,
Susan Ackerman from Oregon, and we agreed beforehand that I would tell you that I'm from a traditionally integrated, vertically integrated state.
Yep, I'm Betty Ann Kane, Chairman of the Public Service Commission here in the District of Columbia, and we are not only at the other end of the country, we're at the other end of the spectrum. The District of Columbia is restructured, really restructured.
Robert Kinney, I'm Chair of the Missouri Public Service Commission, and we are a traditionally vertically integrated state as well.
And Ellen Nowak from the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, and we are a vertically integrated state.
great. Thanks. So let's just jump right in. I think the context was set really well by the previous speakers and the previous panels. In fact, as Susan mentioned during our break, they presented a target-rich environment of ideas for us to address. And so we're going to cover a lot of the ground that they covered, addressing the kinds of questions and challenges and opportunities that they presented in their panels. In addition, I want to note the Edison Foundation's Innovation Foundation's efforts here, because they're providing a pretty amazing convening space for this kind of conversation, and a very timely space. If those of you who follow what goes on in NARUC and those of you who follow what goes on in your states, the questions about what's happening in the energy industry right now are front and center with all of our decision making. And I just also want to acknowledge the kind of place where EEI has come. It was about a year plus ago that the Disruptive Technology Report came out, which I actually would have named something more like the Opportunity-Rich Technology Report, or maybe the Technologies that Create Awesome Economic Business and Public Benefit Opportunities Report. But since that time, where that report framed major concerns and problems on the utility side for the kind of innovations that are happening that you saw in the opening video and that other panelists, Heather Zeichel mentioned, et cetera, we're now at a very different place. And EEI is performing this convening function and clearly is seeing that the utilities are and will play a major role. And part of that shift, I think, as we've seen discussed, has been about the new opportunities that consumers have, whether it's DG, storage, information. And given all of that kind of focus on how consumers are going to be more playing, I actually think this is misnamed. This should be called peopling the power. Okay? I have to think a little bit about that. It's a little bit deep, but all right. So we're going to start with the first question, and it's actually the question that Ted raised in the last panel. He said, both we, that's the utilities and the regulators, have this difficult balancing act. That is, these emerging requirements, emerging demands for greater reliability, integrating renewables, distributed generation, all of these kinds of things that are being asked of the utilities to invest. And he asked whether regulators are engaged in that conversation and how regulators feel about that. And I believe both Leslie and Eric said that regulators are excited. So my first question is, are you excited? Let's hear it. Are you excited about this challenge, this trade-off that we're all dealing with?
Well, speaking for Oregon, yes. There's no better time to be in this industry, so I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Betty.
Yeah, we're very excited. I thought, that we had gone through this sort of exciting time 15 years ago when we restructured and companies had to sell off all their power plants, and that was the big change, that they became a distribution company, and so that was over. Well, that was nothing compared to what we're looking at now in terms of, you said, the role of the consumer, the role of technology. How do you do this balance of still running and keeping a system going when you have got to reach out and bring in so many more players and so many more pieces, some of which are regulated and some of which aren't?
Robert?
Yes, I'm excited. I'm excited about the opportunity for new technologies to be deployed. I get really excited not only about the things that we're talking about that are customer facing, but I get really excited by single phasers and phaser measurement units, because I like to
This
say
is an
that
exciting man to have at a party, but
Yes.
I just want to say
because I like to say synchrophasers, but also because that's where we're going to see real value, I think, to consumers, or the things that our consumers don't see. So I'm excited about all these new technologies and all the things that are possible because of new technologies and what that will mean for consumers. I'm also excited about it personally because it makes our job interesting. I'm excited about the complexity of the problems, and I shouldn't probably use the word problems. I'm excited about the complexity of the challenges that we face and the creative problem solving that we'll have to bring to bear to meet those challenges. So I'm excited.
I am too. Not about single. What are you talking about? Phasers?
Synchrophasers.
I thought I was a nerd. But this is a very exciting time. I came into this industry directly 2.5 years ago. I am continually amazed by the continual learning that you do if you've been in this industry for 2 years or for 10 years, and the challenge that we have to face. I'm excited that we're talking about it, and not to be a buzzkill, but I'm a little worried too, because if we don't get some of the rules right now and look at some of the details right now before some of these opportunities that we are talking about come to fruition, I think we're going to regret some of that later. We're going to, let's not get caught up in the excitement and not look at the details right now.
So let's follow up with that comment. Besides being excited and somewhat worried, I think we probably all share those kind of concerns. So how are you, and this is for each of you, so how are you going about in your commission balancing those issues, coming up with the right rules so that in the future we don't find ourselves in trouble? What's the process that you're going through, the decisions you're making, the criteria that you're using to address these kinds of trade-offs?
You want to start with me?
Sure.
Well, let me use DG as an example. We're having a discussion about it at our commission. We have 6 investor-owned utilities. 5 of them are in this year for a rate case. So this is our opportunity. It's going to be a horrible fall for me personally, which means I have to get my Christmas shopping done very early. But I've been telling our utilities, please come in with ideas on how to, because I think with distributed generation, it's a wonderful thing to have the customers engaged and have a two-way system. But if you don't have a real discussion about what those costs are, and that the DG customer is continually using that grid and continually using the services and getting a right value on what they are using from the system as well as putting into it without shifting costs to others. If we don't take care of that now while it's still relatively small, we're going to have a big problem later. So I am hopeful that, I know one of our utilities actually is here, so I hope he's listening again. Please come in looking for some innovative rate design ideas that assess the cost to the cost causer.
That was on the record, by the way.
Yeah.
Robert?
So the distributed generation issues surrounding DG and wide-scale deployment, we haven't really been hit with that in Missouri yet. We do have a Net Metering and Easy Connection Act that was passed in 2007. And I think to a certain degree that statute helped us to alleviate some of the discussion that we're having now, because we don't compensate customer generators at a full retail rate. They're compensated at an avoided fuel cost rate. And so to a certain degree, the statute was written in such a way that it anticipated potential cost shifting. But I will tell you, we have an Energy Efficiency Investment Act, and that has been a challenge. How do you ask a utility in a vertically integrated state to spend money to encourage consumers to use less of their product? And so
let's hold off on the answer to that
All right.
to a later question, because that is a core one that came up in the last panel as well.
all right.
Yeah.
Ann?
That's actually, Robert's same question, whether it's vertically integrated or restructured. How do you get the distribution system properly paid for? But what we've been dealing with is reliability. We've got had a lot of storms. We've had some major outages in this whole Northeast and Mid-Atlantic area. And what I'm excited about, to get back to the first question, is a whole new way that we have finally come up with new partners, with our city government, with our city Department of Transportation, with our investor-owned utility, and with our People's Council, our consumer advocate, that we have finally come together and we have gotten legislation passed for a whole new approach to financing and managing, putting a significant additional system of our distribution system underground. With a whole new kind of partnership where the City Department of Transportation is going to be using federal highway money. They're going to be doing some of the construction. It was a real thinking outside of the box in terms of people. When we set up that 18 months ago and you looked at the people around the table, you thought we'd never reach agreement. We'd done a study, knew it was a $5 billion. We now have got $1 billion 7-year program with minimal impact on the consumer. And I think it's kind of a way to start thinking not only about what you're delivering, but who you're working with and who's got to be pulled in.
So is the core of that financing that it's shared among these different stakeholders? Ratepayers are paying a piece of it, but
No,
taxpayers
ratepayers are still paying most of it.
Okay.
But because about close to half of it will be paid for either by highway funds, which is not ratepayer money, it's taxpayer money, or a very large chunk of it by bonds that are securitized by the city's bond rating. It's at a much lower rate. And because the city will be doing the construction, there will not be as much of the profit, and so about half of it will be traditional financing, but there will be 2 different surcharges that will go through us.
Susan?
I'm just going to use an example, smart grid, because you want your utilities to be innovative, and you want them to be creative and take risks, but they have to be kind of prudent risks, and that never changes. So what we've done with smart grid is almost like an old issue at this point, because we expect them to do this. But we still expect them to make a business case for it. We will stretch the cost-benefit test. We'll look at all different kinds of benefits. We'll do what we can to be flexible about it. They still have to demonstrate how this, in the long run, saves costs, improves service, and benefits the customer. And they have, by and large, been able to do that. So,
Well, I want to stop for a second, and we're going to try to do something on the Q&A side, that after each of the general questions that I ask, if there is a question from the audience on this topic, so not on other topics, on this particular topic, a comment or a question that you're going to throw out to the panelists, now's your chance. And I'm putting you guys on the spot. Wow, you must have eaten a lot of things for snack at the break. All right, we'll go on to our next question, and then, again, think of it. We're going to ask this question. If you have a question pertaining to this issue, then there'll be an opportunity to ask it. Okay, so in the previous panels, there have been a lot of discussion about communication. And the utilities in the last panel and the tech companies in the prior panel talked about the importance of communicating with stakeholders, with the regulators, with communities, with the consumers, et cetera. Here's the question. The question is, what is the role, is there a role for the regulator to play in communicating to these same kind of stakeholders? And what would that role look like if there should be a role?
Yeah, I'll start. We're still a traditionally vertically integrated utility structure in Oregon, and we are great believers in the integrated resource planning process. Part of that process is a very robust stakeholder communication process. And a lot of the decisions that the utilities make get vetted in that IRP process, but everyone's there. The consumer interest, the commission, staff, environmental interest, anybody who's got anything to say is there. So by the time they are done and they've developed a plan, everyone is on the same page. They may not always agree, but they know what's going on. It makes our job a lot easier. The direct consumer communication that I think needs to happen from us is probably our rate designs. I think consumers don't really appreciate how the system is paid for and what it means, and we send them price signals that probably aren't all that helpful. So that's probably what we could do better.
Yeah. Well, in the restructured environment, I'm saying for us and most of the mid-Atlantic states, we've really shifted an awful lot of decision-making to the consumer. And so I think that we as regulators have a very important role in, quote-unquote, educating the consumers and helping them understand what choices they have in who they buy their electricity from, as well as from their gas and telecom, and what things to consider and what our role is and what our role isn't, and what we can protect them from, what we can give them information about, and the ultimate responsibility on the consumer. It's a big change.
So, and what does that kind of communication outreach look like coming from
us? For example, we've got on our website all of the a calculator. Mm-hmm. You can put in your usage and put in the rates that the various companies are offering. It's a big challenge. It's a whole different relationship to get these companies that we license, but that we don't regulate their price, to get people to understand we don't regulate their price. We can inform you about their price. We have consumer protections and rules and things like the right to cancel a contract and have to have a written contract, and policing all of that is a very, very different role. But you have to continually communicate with people and have them understand the difference between the distribution company and the company that they're buying their electricity from, which for most of our residential consumers is still the same company, but it's very different.
Robert?
No, I think we definitely have a role, and I think the state commissions have a unique role because we represent the public interest. We don't have a pecuniary financial interest, at least a self-directed pecuniary financial interest. We don't have shareholders that we answer to, and so I think that adds a level of credibility to what we say. I think we've done it in Missouri. We've actually taken it upon ourselves to directly reach out to chambers of commerce and civic organizations around the state and go out and offer ourselves to them to do presentations to them on Public Service Commission and Public Utility Regulation 101. We started with chambers and civic organizations because those are typically leaders in those communities that are going to be evangelists for your message. And so, if you are in a state where you're compensating net metering at a full retail rate and you're contemplating changing that, you owe it to consumers to explain why, and to explain to them that the cost of your retail rate includes all of these different components. So if you're changing settled expectations and wanting consumers to behave differently and consume energy differently, they need to understand why they're doing it. So I think it's incumbent upon us to explain how we do what we do, why we do what we do, and what it means to the consumer. And so it means taking a very proactive, affirmative step to reach out to the consumers and to go out there and educate them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We have a very big role, and as Robert noted, I think we do add some credibility to it. I have two speaking engagements coming up this month, completely unrelated to the industry, just community groups. Telling people what we do, people understanding why their bills keep going up. They just blame those regulators. They just keep so understanding, what are the impact of these EPA regulations? Do we have a lot of discretion? A lot of that's mandatory that has to be passed on to consumers. Why are their rates going up? What is the value? What are the costs and benefits of having your own generation? Are the costs going to outweigh the benefits? People need to understand whether that's going to happen or not. Is AMI, there was a lot of misinformation about those smart meters out there. We had calls to our offices about, they're going to cause health issues for me. So, we had to explain a lot of people, you've already had this for a while. Oh, okay. So, I think it's very incumbent upon us just to go out and talk to people. And we do such a good job of talking to each other, of talking at our own conferences, and we get caught up, I think, sometimes way too much in our lingo and our acronyms. And you have to break that when you go out and talk to your legislators, and we have to go out and talk to the public so they understand, because they really don't spend more than probably 30 seconds a month paying their energy bill anyway, but they are going to come talk to you when it keeps going up.
Right. Thanks. Questions on this issue? Yeah. If you could just say who you are and
Steve
what
Minnick.
organization.
Yes. So what are your expectations, commissioners, as to how the utilities communicate and educate the public, and what could they do more, or how could you imagine they could do more to better educate and have them understand what they're doing and the value?
And should you require them to do more? I'm going to add that.
I'll take a stab at this. I think that that's an opportunity, I think, for state commissions to work cooperatively with their regulated utilities outside of an adversarial process. We typically encounter each other in a hearing room during an adversarial process, or at a local public hearing that is an adjunct to the adversarial process. And so one of the things that we did in Missouri is we tried to institute something we called Utility Days, and we've renamed it and reworked it. But it was essentially bringing the utilities together with our Office of Public Counsel and our Public Service Commission staff at a community center to educate consumers about a variety of different issues, but it was outside of the context of a rate case. It was outside of the context of any type of adversarial process, outside of a rulemaking. We went to a community center, and it was actually in conjunction with some other community organizations that were doing education around home heating assistance. And so there are opportunities for public service commissions to interact with their regulated entities outside of the adversarial process, where they can do this type of education together about energy efficiency, about home heating assistance, about weatherization. There's a whole host of already existing community forums that I think you can just insinuate yourself into and invite your electric and gas utilities to join you in that process.
Yeah, one of the things that at least one or two of our utilities do is they ask the commissioners to come speak to some of their larger, smaller, different customer groups, which is a great opportunity. It's, again, outside of the adversarial process. I think, a lot of utilities are a little hesitant to I can't talk to you, and you don't even have an open case, but it's just like I have to go through somebody else, and we're approachable. Ask us, and we will try to come talk.
Nice even.
Most of the time, we don't fight.
Yeah, I think there are ways to do education together too, more within the regulatory context. For example, for our utility discount programs, which is gas, electric, telephone, and water discounts, we have a working group which includes not only the staffs from those agencies, but the utilities themselves. And they sit down and we're talking about what kind of consumer material do we put out, a joint flyer that has all the discounts on it, telling people about energy efficiency, et cetera. And even within the regulatory context, we just have come off, careful what I say, because I think it's final, on redoing bill format. And you say, well, why do we be involved? Well, how a bill is presented, particularly again in a restructured state, but even if you're talking about energy efficiency, is an educational tool for the utility with the consumers. So we felt that was important in terms of redoing how some of the bills were done and how things were laid out and what was in what category and what was on what page as an educational as well as an informative kind of process.
We had, just as a side note, we had in Massachusetts, we had thought about opening up a proceeding on bills that we internally called cool bills, because we wanted to figure out a way that could communicate in a way that excited customers. Susan?
I don't have any data.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Good question. So next question. So speaking about communication, there's been a lot of communication in the last year or so about this death spiral that we've been hearing about. So my question is, do you think that the death spiral is real? Why? Why not?
I'll start.
All right.
I don't think it's real. I don't think it's in my lifetime. It's clearly, I'm taking with all due caution the remarks that was made by the gentleman from IBM this morning about everyone thought the mainframe would never go out of business. And I get his point, I get the analogy. But I don't see how distributed generation can function without the grid. The grid's always going to be there. It needs to be there. It needs to be maintained. It needs to be healthy. Holding out a little bit of doubt about when battery technology finally catches up. I suppose that there could be a future where people will actually disconnect from the grid and rely on batteries and solar panels. But I think that's going to be isolated. I think it's going to be in certain parts of the country, not the country widely. And I don't expect that the utilities are going to be in a death spiral. I also don't think that we're without tools. I mean, there are all sorts of rate design steps that can be taken. Rate design, regulatory mechanisms, incentive mechanisms, all sorts of things that can be done that will allow the utility to be compensated justly for its investments and keep it whole, and I think that'll happen. So,
You're always going to need infrastructure. I think there will be a lot of change, and particularly at the generation
Hold on,
side.
answer the question. Death spiral, yes or no?
Yes or no? No.
Okay.
No death spiral.
Okay, proceed.
Because you're always going to need infrastructure. Even if it's scattered, somebody's got to be pulled together. Somebody's got to be in charge of it. Somebody's got to interconnect it. Somebody's got to be sure that it's all working together. I think there are things that utilities are going to let go of, are going to have to let go of, or they're going to be taken away just even by the customers, maybe more on the generation side, more on the inside the home, more on the equipment, the sort of bells and whistles. But there's always going to be a need, I think, for that basic infrastructure and for some coordination of that. Whether you call it monopoly or whether you call it coordination, you do not want cities with 4 different sets of cables, distribution cables running down the street or on the poles. That's how we started at the turn of the century, the turn of the last century. So I think that the utilities will be different, but they're certainly going to be there.
Robert?
No. And so,
Okay.
but let me make an observation. I have a couple of observations about this. I think I have found in this industry that we like to use like really hyperbolic language like death spiral and train wreck and big data and disruptive technologies. We like to use these phrases that cause us to pay a lot of attention to specific issues. And so, I think so we use the phrase death spiral, and now it's got us talking about it. But no, I don't think that the utilities are going to die. I think that the types of technologies that we are seeing are causing the utilities to maybe have to pursue different revenue streams. Somebody made the point about revenue streams drying up, and I think if the utilities decide to do that, we have regulatory mechanisms in place to already deal with that. I look at gas companies that sell gas, but then also sell hot water heaters, and they provide other services. And we have affiliate transaction rules that deal with that to ensure that the costs allocated between a non-regulated entity and the regulated entity are appropriate. And so I think that we're entering this era in which we are having to think radically differently, but I don't think it's going to kill the regulatory model, and I don't think it's going to kill the utility business model. It's just going to require us to think differently and to think creatively, and to employ tools that I think we already have examples of in different ways.
Ellen?
No, it's not a death spiral, but I think it's a wake-up call to us, to regulators, to the industry, to consumers, to, okay, things are going to be changing, that happens in this industry, it happens in every industry. We're just going to have to sit down, we're going to have maybe some difficult conversations for some people, because they're going to have to understand the true costs of everything. And educate, but it's just an opportunity.
Okay. So let it be said that from this point on, we expect not to see death spiral in the trade press, media. The death spiral is dead. Okay, well, I think we're in agreement on that. I see nobody saying no. Okay, follow up on, hold on, we'll get to your question, but I want to, along these same lines, because both Betty Ann and Robert mentioned something along these lines in terms of kind of new services, et cetera. In the last panel, there was a conversation about, well, what happens inside the house, behind the meter? Is that a space that utilities should play in, or is that a space that the third-party providers or innovators or the folks who were in the first panel should be providing? And there wasn't a sufficient enough argument between those two panels about who carves up that space, what's the competition. So how do we think about that from a regulatory perspective?
Remember when the only phone you could get was the one the telephone company gave you? We're not going to go back to that. And I think that in any of these utilities, and I think what's inside the home is free for all, and there are a lot of other providers. Maybe some concerns about connecting it, but they used to claim that if you didn't use the phone that AT&T gave you, that the whole system would blow up. So I think that's out of the box. I think things like information, using the smart meters, connecting with the smart meters so you're inside the equipment, paying your bill. It's already happening, paying your bills over I could pay my Pepco bill on my iPhone. I can track my daughter's use because she lives in a house I own that I'm renting to her, her electricity use on my laptop. And so those things, that is so much so much already an unregulated industry that for a utility, aside from, my only personal view, aside from an affiliate where there is a wall, should not and will not be in that business.
Robert, I'll get to Alan.
I think it's up to them, and I think somebody made
Up to who, the utilities?
Up to utility,
Yeah.
and then somebody made the point. I can't remember, one of the other panelists said that there are some CEOs who are of the thought that that's not our skill set. I'm not going to do that, and then there are a group that say I'm not giving up my customer over my dead body. And so I think it's going to be reflective of the thinking of the leadership of the utility. But again, you have an unregulated entity that wants to provide services inside the house. Go for it. And we'll deal with it with affiliate transaction rules and a cost allocation manual like we have done before. I would say it seems like it makes sense to do it if, on the one hand, you're saying that all of these other public policies are requiring us to look for other revenue streams because of energy efficiency mandates or whatever the case may be, and then you are presented with opportunities for other revenue streams. It seems to make sense that they would think about doing it.
But doesn't that give unfair advantage to the utilities? That now the third parties, new startups, the green innovation folks can't play on a level playing field because they don't have access to the customers?
Well, I think that what we're seeing would belie that because the non-utility affiliated entities are doing it now, and they're doing it fine, and they have access to that data through other mechanisms. So I don't think that the utility may have an advantage in some respect because they have a pre-existing relationship with the customer, but I don't think that they are in an information advantage per se.
Ellen?
Yeah, I don't know if you were necessarily disagreeing with Betty Ann. As long as the regulated entity isn't, getting an unfair advantage with the competitive market. We had a similar situation in Wisconsin with natural gas and supply. And as long as there's clear lines between the regulated entity and the affiliates that aren't regulated by us, they are free to compete on that other side of the line. But I think we need to be careful to have the regulated entity kind of stay in its lane and do its business.
Susan?
I guess I'd share that. I mean, I don't have any problem with the utility getting into that business, as long as we know what responsibilities are what, and there's still going to always be that responsibility for keeping the whole distribution system and grid operating, and then the stuff behind the home. I wouldn't say they couldn't get into it. I'd like to see a business plan or something like that, and got separations rules and things like that.
Quick question over here for this question. Did you have one, sir? Yep.
I would just follow on to that with a question about security. One of the gentlemen said that when he walks by his Nest thermostat, Google knows he's there, and they know how long his baths are and how often he washes his clothes. Are these things that you think your customers want their utilities to know, or they would rather that Google knew it?
Let's take this quickly.
I'd rather no one.
Quick response to this one.
It's up to the customer. The customer owns the data. They have the right to say who gets access to it, the same as any other consumer product that you have. And as long as you've got good rules or good laws in place about who can share that data with what kind of permission, that's the marketplace. But the rules are important in the privacy.
I think the rules are important, but also educating the consumer again is important, because somebody made the comment, from one of the other panelists, that he interacted with a customer who said, I don't want a smart meter in my home because I don't want the utility knowing how much electricity I use. So I think that reflects maybe a lack of understanding that the consumer has about what data is actually being gathered and who owns it in the first place. I'd prefer nobody know when I'm taking my baths. But again, I think your question begs an additional question about the need to educate consumers.
Quick question here. We're in speed round.
There's an assumption in this last question that there's a fundamental dividing line between what's behind the meter in front. If you listen to the technology guys this morning, that doesn't exist. The way these systems work is sort of this ecosystem of data. Okay? So the question I have, if that's true, we talk about all these very smart appliances and great stuff, but you can see that some people can afford that, and there are other people who may not be able to. So you have a chance of having significant costs in infrastructure that has to be socialized broadly within rate classes, but the benefits are not socialized. How do you think about that from a regulatory perspective?
Anyone have an answer?
Well, which
Susan?
things are being
Well,
purchased on the inside
well,
of the home that are going to be socialized? I mean,
yeah,
the guy that buys a Nest meter is paying for that, and if I buy appliances, I'm paying for that. I mean, the rebate that's associated with it may be socialized. But which infrastructure?
Not falling again on the technology. I mean, we did cost-benefit analysis on the smart meters. We've got smart meters in 97, 98% of the homes now. But the benefits, the cost, and the benefits were what are the benefits to the distribution grid, and what are the benefits to the consumer of knowing in much more real time what their usage is, so that they can control it. Not quite falling, I turn about behind the meter costs of a smart meter.
Yeah, just a quick, I could see one advantage to having a utility, what we call behind the meter in the home with the consumer, and that might be to automate and streamline some of these energy efficiency programs, for example. If you can get a program that, by virtue of the thermostat and the appliances talking to each other and talking to the grid, and they can reduce consumption overall or shift consumption away from costly time periods, for example. That, to me, would be a good energy efficiency program. And so I wouldn't rule out the prospect that a utility could invest in that and recover the costs of it. But it just comes straight back to the business case. Is it worthwhile for all consumers for the utility to be doing that? But I tend to agree with what Robert and Betty Ann said, that the people buying the Nest thermostats, that's their dime. Not.
I'm going to respond also. I'm going to jump out of moderator role into panelist mode for a second. I think if I understand your question, which has multiple parts to it, one part of it is you regulate in a wise kind of way, so that, for example, in Massachusetts, the energy efficiency programs and the solar programs are designed and targeted so that there isn't great disparity across income classes. I think people will be surprised to find that in Massachusetts, low-income homes, the percentage of low-income homes that have PV is commensurate with the percent of low-income families in the population, and likewise on the middle and high income. So it's commensurate. This is not a high-income luxury thing that people are doing in Massachusetts. And likewise, in energy efficiency, there are programs targeted at low-income customers. Nope, I'm not going to let you ask a follow-up because I have more follow-ups. I'm back to being moderator. Sorry. All right. Okay, so one of the questions that came up in one of the earlier panels was about energy efficiency. And there's been lots of debate about that. It relates to the death spiral question, right, because we lose revenues. And yet energy efficiency in many states and on the federal level has really been targeted as, people call it, the cheapest fuel. They're big cost savings for customers. They're big cost savings on infrastructure in the grid. In New England, we've avoided about $200 to $300 million of transmission projects because of our energy efficiency programs. But the question is, how do we, is energy efficiency something that we, as regulators, should be pushing utilities hard on? And if so, how do we do that in a way that addresses all of these kinds of questions? For example, the not shall be spoken death spiral issue. Yes.
Well, I'm going to jump in and say, yes, we should be pushing utilities hard on energy efficiency. You can look at a supply curve of all the ways you can serve a customer, and energy efficiency is still the cheapest resource by a wide country mile. It does put the utility in an awkward spot because they will tend to lose revenue, but that's why you do things like you do decoupling, or you change your rate design so you've got more fixed costs and fixed charges. There are all sorts of ways of addressing that. And I think, frankly, the utility commission that requires the utility to charge on a dollar per unit of energy basis sold and then requires the utility to try to reduce sales is not being fair to the utility. That's a personal opinion, but there are ways of dealing with that. So,
go down the row.
Yeah, I actually agree with Susan on that. I think you've got a responsibility if you're doing energy efficiency, and that's a goal of the commission, a goal of the state, that you also have a responsibility to be sure that your fixed costs that are not affected by consumption, that don't vary by consumption, get recovered in a fair and equitable way also. Actually, in the district, we have I'm not saying our authority over energy efficiency was taken away, but it's been superseded by a sustainable energy utility, like Efficiency Vermont and all, and that's paid for by the ratepayers. It's going to be $15–20 million a year in the next couple of years, but they run the energy efficiency programs. We sit on the board as an advisory member. There's a lot of concern about how it's working, et cetera. But that I heard one of the earlier panelists say that the best energy efficiency program was your building code, and I'd agree with that too. That's outside the control of utility and outside the control of a regulatory commission.
Robert, Alan?
I think we do have a responsibility for the economic reasons that Susan described. I think that makes economic sense. And then in Missouri, we have an Energy Efficiency Investment Act that requires us, and it sets forth the policy of the state that we will value investments in cost-effective energy efficiency on par with supply-side investments. And so and we were charged with drafting rules to implement that statute, and our rules allow for the recovery of lost revenues, which I thought was actually troubling and problematic for a whole host of reasons, because I thought decoupling might have been a more elegant way to deal with it. But our utilities actually came to a negotiated proposal that was a stakeholder-driven process where they get to recover the costs obviously associated with administering the programs, and they can set up a regulatory asset to earn on it as well. And then they, as an incentive, they are able to keep a portion of the net shared benefits that are calculated, and that's all set forth in the proposal how that's calculated. But it's robust EM&V at the end of a 3-year program, and they get to keep some percentage of the net shared benefits commensurate with targets that they have hit. And so there are ways to do it, because the traditional business model, it's counterintuitive to ask the widget maker to sell less widgets. But we have regulatory tools to address that.
Oh.
Well, Wisconsin's addressed that, or answered that question by requiring utilities to contribute 1.2% of their revenues into a statewide energy efficiency program that is in part overseen by the commission, but we contracted out to a third-party administrator. That started about 12 years ago. Prior to that, we required the utilities to engage in energy efficiency, and what we saw was a patchwork of participation levels and different programs being offered, and there was a policy decision made 12 years ago to let's have a statewide program, pool all the money together, and then redistribute it back out. And there's pluses and minuses to that, and we can talk about that for a long time, and every day I can go back and forth on what side I'm on, because it's costly at the same time too. So I'm always continuing to ask, are we getting enough out of it? Because there's heavy administrative burden to that work too. And, and when we're seeing utilities with very flat load growth and also then taking these revenues away from them, there's a struggle there. There's an absolute struggle.
So Massachusetts has done something similar to Missouri in that totally recreated, except that we've done decoupling, but made it part and parcel of the business model of the utilities there. They are the ones who deliver the service. We spend about $1 billion a year on energy efficiency and get about $6 billion in savings over time. And we've recently, and for the last 3 years, surpassed California as #1 in energy efficiency. I'm required to say that by contract. So just want to make sure I got that.
Dave, I think there's one other part, not to interrupt the flow here, that we're kind of overlooking to, at least in some of our states, and that is your organized markets, your wholesale markets, and
exactly
the merchant
right.
generators, and particularly in the PJM, your demand response, and
Plays in the market.
all of those other aspects which are outside the control of any state regulator, but are a very important aspect of how you can finance and how you can have energy efficiency and other kinds of things happen.
Energy efficiency question over there.
So it's a two-part question because you won't allow a follow-up. My name is Shelley Fiddler with
So
Van Ness
sneaky.
Feldman.
Okay, that's enough.
And I would like to ask you wonderful regulators about what is your view of the utility of the future if you put it through the 111D filter? And second of all, and please include it in your answer, how can we encourage energy efficiency as part of compliance to help utilities afford compliance?
So kind of combining the 111D requirements with energy efficiency. Ellen.
Well, I think this is where, on the days where I'm pro statewide program, when we have to look at complying with 111D, back in December we filed our comments with the EPA jointly with our Department of Natural Resources. And one of the things that we told the EPA is, hey, we've got some resources existing already in the state and RPS and a statewide energy efficiency program that we've been able to calculate some real savings on carbon emissions. So please let that count towards a compliance option for 111D. So I think that's going to be a key component in hoping that cost alone, because the other costs and the other ways to deal with 111D are quite costly. So we want to be able to use some existing state programs. We don't have $1 billion program, it's about $100 million. So we're doing a little better.
So the question was, what's the utility of the future through the 111D prism? I think that each state is required under 111D to draft its own state implementation plan. So I think as a threshold matter, it's going to vary from state to state, as it appropriately should. We filed similar comments asking the EPA to be mindful of the fact that we have an Energy Efficiency Investment Act that is having the effect of reducing emissions, and we have a renewable portfolio standard with which our utilities are trying to comply that is also going to have the effect of reducing emissions. Missouri is in a unique position because 80% of our generation is coal-fired. So there are significant reliability concerns about environmental regulations that would potentially have a significant impact on the reliability in our state. And so I think we've got to do what we can in terms of informing the debate at the EPA, and I think we're doing that through NARUC. We've done that individually. Wisconsin, Missouri, I'm sure all the other states are filing their comments, making sure that the EPA understands the unique position that each state is in and what we're already doing.
Great question. We have about 2 minutes, so here's my surprise question for the panelists. Let's say in 20 years, you're retired, and you're on a panel of retired commissioners or something at some meeting, and you are asked, what decision did your commission make 20 years ago to bring us into the smart grid, modern grid that we are now enjoying 20 years hence?
I may sound like a broken record,
No, go.
but getting the rates right. I mean, restructuring rates and having them accurately reflect the cost in this new world that we're living in, where you've got DG and smart grid and everyone's still using the system, but some people still having their own. So I think that's going to be it.
All right, two things in the state. I think making sure that we have enhanced to the greatest extent possible our community outreach and our external affairs, as I like to call it. And I call it external affairs because it's reaching out to civic organizations, the media, and to our General Assembly to make sure that all three of those constituents are properly educated. I think if we can figure out a way, and we're working towards it in Missouri, if we can figure out a way to make what we do interesting to those broad constituencies and then be able to effectively communicate it to them, we will have come a long way. The second thing is enhancing our participation in our regional state organizations with our RTO. I think that transmission investment, although it's still a de minimis part of the bill, comparatively speaking, it's becoming more and more important, particularly as we socialize those costs. So enhancing the role of state regulators in the MISO footprint is something I'll say I was proud of.
Betty Ann.
I would say, 20 years now, looking back, that if we had put the right kind of process in place and to encourage and support investment in the basic infrastructure that was robust, that was resilient, that was up to date in terms of all the electronics, et cetera, on it, that was easily upgradable, and that was flexible for whatever's going to come, whether it's microgrids and combined heat or power, et cetera. To just getting that right and getting it done and getting it just getting it to the point where it can cope with whatever comes.
Last word, Susan.
I would say our smart grid order, which required our utilities to plan for smart grid investments and do them as the planning requirements indicated, and also a decision we made 2 or 3 years ago now to shut down our only coal plant in the state early instead of making a very large investment in scrubbers to meet regional haze rules. So.
Thank you. I'd love everybody to join me in thanking this awesome panel on peopling the power. Thank you very much, and move on.